Hi there, Mr. Reardon here. I am going to be walking you through the third of our grammar concepts for this semester, and this concept is verb types. So let's jump right in. In order for you to really grasp the concept of verb types, you need to know a few things about basic English sentence structure. I imagine that you have learned a lot of this before, but it will be beneficial for you, I think, to have this review before we immediately jump into the verb types. So the basic structure of an English sentence is subject, verb, object, with lots of modifications as you make the sentence more complex. So the subject is just the thing doing the verb's action. The verb is the word that tells us what the action is, right? Or once in a while, it's more than one word acting like the verb. And then, of course, we have the object. And that is the thing that is receiving the action of the verb. The subject is verbing, and often the subject is verbing the object. So some examples. Jesse plays civilization, right? Jesse is the subject, plays the verb, civilization the object, right? The Jesse is the subject because Jesse is doing the playing, right? And civilization is the game being played, right? So that is right. So civilization is the object of the verb to play in this context. Sylvia kicked Jonathan, right? Sylvia is kicking. Jonathan was kicked, right? So Jonathan is our object. Sylvia is our subject, right? Brandon will start the long potato gunfight series, right? These rules apply not just to single nouns, right? The rules for subject and objects, but also with phrases, right? So I could say Brandon or Brandon and Sylvia, right? Will start future tense verb, right? And then this entire phrase acting like one noun, right? Behaving like a noun phrase. The long potato gunfight series, which altogether is the object of the verb to start that happens to be in the third person singular future tense. So some languages happen to differ in this structure, right? Not every language operates on a subject verb object system, right? So in English, we would say, Jinbo eats an apple. But in Japanese, it would be expressed a bit like this. If you speak Japanese, I imagine you can read that. But if you don't, here's a gloss. Jinbo, apple, eat, right? Those are that would be how the idea is expressed in Japanese, because in Japanese, the basic syntactic structure is subject, object, verb, instead of subject, verb, object, like in English and many other European languages. So, moving right on. You also need to know a little more about objects. There are two kinds of objects: direct objects, which will be coded green, and indirect objects, which henceforth will be coded purple. Right? So direct objects are objects that directly receive the action of the verb. Examples: same sentences as before. Jesse plays civilization. Right? Civilization is being played, right? That's the thing being played. The verb to play is acting directly on, right, the verb or this object, this noun, civilization. Same sentence again. Brandon will start the long potato gunfight series, right? What is being started? The long potato gunfight series is being started. So that entire noun phrase is the direct object of the verb to start, of course, in the future tense. Now, indirect objects operate a little differently. Indirect objects are only indirectly involved in the action of the verb, right? The verb is acting on a direct object, and then there is an indirect object there that is involved somehow, but that is not directly involved. Usually in English, when we put the direct object first and then we follow it with an indirect object, there will be a preposition to or of inserted that will help us to identify it as the indirect object. So Jessie gave a cold to her sister, right? That to is there to indicate the right? The fact that her sister was the recipient of the cold, right? But the giving was the cold is actually what was given, right? So the cold is the direct object, and her sister is the indirect object. Now, English is a wily language, and it allows us to switch the order of the objects and still express the same idea, except you could drop the preposition. So we could also say English gave, or I mean, excuse me, Jessie gave her sister a cold, right? Now, in day-to-day speech, this system, or this syntactical structure, is actually much more common, right? People actually default to this structure: subject, verb, indirect object, direct object with no preposition, right? More often. So again, even though we switch them, right? Her sister is still our indirect object, and a cold is still the thing that was given, right? So a cold is still the direct object. Second one, right? Carla asked a question of the teacher, right? And it's similar sentence. Carla asked the teacher a question, right? So a question is what's being asked, direct object. The teacher is the person being asked, right? The teacher is indirectly involved in the asking of the question, but less involved than Carla is, right? Because Carla is actually asking, and the question is being asked by Carla. Now, again, you can switch the order and drop the preposition. So we could say, Carla asked the teacher a question. So we can now jump into the verb types. Typically, we talk about verb types only in sentences that already exist, right? Now, when I assess you on this grammar topic and on the other grammar topics, right, I will not just give you one verb and say, tell me whether the verb to give is one of these types, right? I'm not going to do that. Instead, I will give you a whole sentence and I will ask you, in this sentence, how is this one verb behaving, right? So it's always in the context of a sentence. If you look up a verb in a dictionary, right, it's going to tell you, right, the different ways the verb can be used. Some verbs can be used in many different ways, but I will always give you one sentence and there will be one correct answer. So here are the 4 verb types you need to know. Intransitive verbs, transitive verbs, ditransitive verbs, and copular verbs. So just a little note here, why should you know this, right? Why does this matter? Well, first of all, you are likely to come across sentences whose meanings you do not understand, right? You read the sentence once and you don't get meaning from it like you do most sentences you come across, right? So you have to slow down, you have to identify the parts of speech, you have to figure out where the subjects, objects, and verbs are, right? You have to figure out which verbs are acting on which objects and how, right? And how each set of subject, object, and verb is related to the ones around, to the sets around them, right? That is how you break up a sentence. And so, like all of the other grammar topics, verb types is ultimately a reading strategy. Now, also, verb types is one of the grammar topics we're covering that will help you to understand a later grammar topic, that topic being parallel structure. Right? Parallel structure is really hard to grasp unless you know all of the things we're talking about: verb tense, verb type, parts of speech, pronouns, antecedents. You need all of these pieces to grasp parallel structure thoroughly, right? So parallel structure is an essential strategy for clear and convincing writing. It can make writing really compelling, really persuasive. You need to be able to identify it. It is a rhetorical strategy you could write about in a rhetorical analysis essay. You could be asked about it in multiple choice questions on the exam. The SAT, right, expects that you understand and can recognize various forms of parallel structure, right? So, right, you need the verb types. It's essential. So let's start with intransitive verbs, right? Intransitive verbs do not have objects receiving their action, right? A verb that doesn't have an object receiving its action is intransitive. So let's look at I run. I run, right? This sentence is expressing that running is something that I do regularly. I am leaving. All right, that's what I'm doing right now. We're in a progressive aspect here. At this very moment, I'm leaving. I don't have to say I'm leaving something, right? Can just, in this context, I can just say I'm leaving, and it makes sense. It conveys the idea. I drove. How did you get here today? I drove. Right? That's a sentence by itself. Now, a non-example, right? I hit. I hit what? Right? You need an object. In this, or the verb hit, in fact, requires at least one object. Same thing with I brought, right? I brought requires one object. If you try to say this, use these verbs without at least one direct object, right? Then they don't make sense, right? And so these are obligatory transitive verbs. They have to have objects, right? So again, these two verbs require at least one object. They are not intransitive. But the first three, right, in this context, I run, I am leaving, I drove, absolutely intransitive verbs, no objects required. Okay, transitive verb. A transitive verb is a verb that has one object receiving its action. So I ate the pizza. The pizza is being eaten, right? And so, right, I am the one eating the pizza, and so the pizza is directly receiving the action of the verb to eat. I saw a Barbie doll factory fire, right? The thing that is seen is the Barbie doll factory fire, so direct object. And again, this verb saw needs this one object. I saw, period. That would make sense if you're talking about something that goes on in a sawmill, right? Sawing. I saw, as in regular. I saw regularly. But when you're talking about the past tense of to see, what did you see? Well, you need that, right? You need this object in order for it to make sense. And so in this context, I saw a Barbie doll factory fire, right? Saw is behaving like a transitive verb, right? The teacher has 3 great big green guard dragons, right? Same thing going on here. That whole green portion, 3 great big green guard dragons, is behaving like one noun phrase. All of that together is the object of the verb to have, and to have is behaving here like a transitive verb. Okay. Except in rare strange cases, I will never give you a case where, right, one of the rare cases in English, right, where a verb takes only an indirect object, right, as its argument. When you have transitive verbs, they almost always take one direct object only. They do not take, they don't take just one indirect object. That doesn't happen. There are a few rare cases in English where it can happen, just because English is this really flexible, evolving language, and there are certain phrases where it happens to do that thing, right? But it's fairly rare. So I'm not going to give you that in any kind of assessment situation, and you don't really need to be able to identify cases where you have a transitive verb with one indirect object as its argument. Ditransitive verbs. So, excuse me. A ditransitive verb is a verb that has 2 objects, right? Ditransitive verbs take one direct object and one indirect object, right? So I gave the mug to Paula. The mug is being given. It is the direct object, but it's being given to a person, right? And that person is Paula. So Paula is indirectly receiving the action of gave, right? So Paula is behaving like an indirect object. Now, gave needs both of these objects in order to make sense, right? If I were to try to say, I gave the mug, you're left with the question in your brain, to whom, right? And then if I were to say, I gave Paula, right? I gave Paula what? There's missing information. You need both pieces in order for the sentence to make sense, right? I gave, and I want to mention here again, all of these sentences have variants. right? So I can switch around the indirect object and the direct object and say I gave Paula the mug, right? And it's still a ditransitive verb, two objects, except the indirect object is first, preposition is dropped, and the mug direct object comes after. Okay, same thing going on here. She handed the scissors to me, right? So, right, the scissors are being handed, and indirectly, right, I am the indirect object here, right, because I am the person to whom the scissors are being handed, right, and then the pair sentence there. She handed me the scissors. Same thing going on. The two objects are just switched. So I want to mention something here about the verb to give. Right, the to give is this really flexible verb because it can be used in many different ways, and we do this all the time. To give, or I give, really means I give up. Like I throw in the towel, I'm done, I concede defeat. That is behaving intransitively. It doesn't need any object. Yes, I give a hoot. Right, hoot there replacing a phrase that I think people say more often, but that might not be appropriate for this presentation. And right, in both of those related linguistic cases, a hoot or its equivalent would be the direct object, right? And so there's one give has one object and it's behaving transitively. So this is a nice example of how one verb can be intransitive, transitive, or ditransitive. Alrighty, please be careful. Just because you see a preposition does not necessarily mean that you have an indirect object, right? It's a very common error on the part of students that they identify a verb as ditransitive when in fact it is intransitive or transitive, and there just happened to be a prepositional phrase hanging around. So examples, right? I spoke to the manager. I spoke. That's a perfectly okay sentence, right? You're not missing any information, right? I can just say I spoke. Right, the fact that the speaking happened to the manager, right, is just expressing location, direction, and helping to make the sentence and idea more specific. It's a prepositional phrase. It's not an object. The manager is not an indirect object, and spoke is not a ditransitive verb here. It is intransitive. I beat the drum. Right, the drum was beat. That's what happened here. So that again, the drum is a direct object, right, receiving the action of to beat, and all of this other information, these two prepositional phrases, to the rhythm of the music, right, just helps to, right, make the sentence and idea more specific and express express exactly how the drum was beat, right? And so these prepositional phrases add information, but again, neither of them is an indirect object of beating, right? They just happen to be additional prepositional phrases. Beat here is behaving transitively. Okay, last type, copular verbs. So copular verbs are verbs that take adjectives as their objects, right? They are a little different than the other three kinds of verbs because all of those other kinds either had no object or they had nouns or noun phrases as their objects. Copular verbs take adjectives as their objects instead. Typically, these sentences are offering description or expressing state of being of some subject. So I am excited about grammar, right? In order to describe myself as excited, right, excited about grammar, I need this form of the verb to be, which is am. She is sad. We're describing her temporary state as sad. Jenny and Mariah are extraordinarily intelligent. I guess that R should be blue. So they are, right, in order to describe them as intelligent, right, we need this verb to be. To be is by far the most common copular verb in English, right? So to be, you have to think about all the forms of to be. Am, is, are, was, were, being, been, be, right? All of them. Those in different forms will be will often be serving as copular verbs. To be can also be a transitive verb in some cases, right? But it is, right? Jenny and Mariah are engineers. Well, an engineer is a noun, so now to be is behaving like a transitive verb, right? So you have to pay attention. If what comes after is an adjective or adjective phrase, right, then you probably have um, a copular verb on your hands. So to be is not the only one, right? There are others. Doesn't the substitute teacher seem off to you, right? Off in this case is behaving like an adjective, meaning like maybe not quite in her right mind or his right mind, right? I feel sick, right? So feeling in this case, right, is it's a state of being, temporary state of being, and sick is an adjective. Alrighty, that's all I have for you. You should have enough to complete the exercises for our next class meeting, and you can see the citations for this presentation down there at the bottom. Thank you.